Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Los Angeles. March 23, 2011. Morning. Elizabeth Taylor had been there for 6 weeks, admitted on February 11th with congestive heart failure, a condition she'd been fighting since her diagnosis in 2004. She was 79 years old. The disease had narrowed her world down to that hospital, to that floor, to that room, over the preceding weeks. And by the end, there was nothing left to do but wait. When she died, her publicist, Sally Morrison, issued a statement to ABC News and the New York Times. Brief, factual, the way those statements always are. But one sentence in it contained the entire story. She was surrounded by her children, Michael Wilding, Christopher Wilding, Liza Todd, and Maria Burton. All 4. Every single one. That fact alone dismantles a narrative that has been circulating with increasing confidence. That Elizabeth Taylor, a woman of 8 marriages and one of the most relentlessly documented lives the 20th century produced, died estranged from the children those marriages and that chaos had shaped. The premise is seductive. It fits a familiar template of Golden Age Hollywood as tragedy factory. It's also false. What the documented record shows is that Michael, Christopher, Liza, and Maria were in that building for weeks before the end, and in that room when it came. That doesn't mean the title's emotional premise is entirely hollow. The anger was real. The damage was real. Children raised inside the most photographed, most reported on household of the 1960s and 1970s carry specific marks, and Taylor's children carried theirs. But permanent estrangement, a deathbed abandoned? That didn't happen. What happened is more complicated, and the complicated version is the one worth understanding. To understand why all 4 of those children were in that hospital room on March 23, 2011, you have to start at the beginning of what being Elizabeth Taylor's child actually was. Michael Howard Wilding, Jr. was born on January 6, 1953, in Santa Monica, California. His father was the British actor Michael Wilding, Taylor's second husband, a man more than 20 years her senior. The union was relatively stable by Taylor's eventual standards, which meant it lasted 5 years before collapsing. Michael was 4 when his parents' marriage ended in 1957. Christopher Edward Wilding followed on February 27, 1955, sharing his birthday exactly with his mother, which is the kind of biographical detail that seems too deliberate for real life, but is simply true. Elizabeth Taylor and her second son were born on the same day, 23 years apart. Christopher was 2 when the marriage ended. Both boys were photographed from infancy, identified in newspapers and fan magazines as Elizabeth Taylor's sons. Their faces were public property before they had opinions about anything. This is worth understanding precisely. They didn't become famous and then learn to manage it. They were born into it. Their entire developmental childhood, the years of learning that you are a separate person with an interior life that belongs to you, happened inside a fishbowl that never once went dark. In 1957, Mike Todd arrived. Taylor married him on February 2nd of that year, and every account of the relationship describes it as genuinely, turbulently joyful, the loudest, most extravagant version of happiness she'd managed. Their daughter, Liza Frances Todd, was born August 6, 1957, in New York. For a little under a year, the household had some version of equilibrium. 2 young boys, a new baby daughter, a mother in love in the particular way she was when she was in love, which was completely and with her whole body and all her noise. Then the night of March 22nd, 1958. Mike Todd boarded a twin-engine Lockheed aircraft in Burbank, bound for New York. The plane went down near Grants, New Mexico in the dark. The official cause was engine failure, combined with icy conditions and aircraft overload. Todd was 50. Liza was 7 months old. Michael Wilding Jr. was 5. Christopher was 3. Taylor wasn't on the flight. She had stayed home with a chest cold. She was 26 years old when the call came, widowed, with a 7-month-old and 2 other small children. And the grief that followed was total. She collapsed. She was hospitalized. The press covered her devastation in the detail that only the early era of mass celebrity gossip culture could produce. The sedation, the physical collapse, the enormity of visible suffering. Liza would never form a single conscious memory of her father. Not one. She grew up knowing Mike Todd entirely through other people's accounts of him, through photographs, through the scale of her mother's grief over him, and through what that grief immediately became. Because within months of Todd's death, Taylor sought comfort from Todd's closest friend, Eddie Fisher, who was at the time married to Debbie Reynolds. The affair detonated one of the defining scandals of the era. The public turned on Taylor with a ferocity that seems disproportionate even now, condemned from pulpits, threatened with film boycotts, dragged through columns and magazine covers as America's homewrecker, while Debbie Reynolds became America's sympathetic wronged wife. While Michael was 5, Christopher was 3, and Liza was an infant. Their mother was the most vilified woman in America. They grew up in the atmosphere that followed. Liza Todd would spend her adult life as the daughter of a dead legend she couldn't remember, and the child of a mother whose response to that loss had cost them all something permanent in terms of public standing. That specific psychological weight, grief for an absence you can't even remember feeling the presence of, is distinct from anything her brothers carried, and it was there from before she could speak. Eddie Fisher married Taylor in 1959. The marriage lasted until 1964, long enough to overlap with the arrival of Richard Burton. Taylor met Burton on the set of Cleopatra in Rome in 1962, and their affair began during production, in full view of the international press corps. By the time Taylor and Fisher divorced in March 1964, the Burton marriage was inevitable. On March 15, 1964, she and Burton married for the first time. What this meant for the children was Burton, and Burton meant something specific that the mythology has sometimes softened in the retelling. He was, by every account, a man of extraordinary intelligence, magnetic presence, and almost total inability to moderate his drinking. Sam Kashner and Nancy Schoenberger, who wrote Furious Love, the most comprehensive account of the Taylor-Burton relationship, describe a household in perpetual motion, tracking the Burtons from first-class hotel to first-class hotel, city to city, country to country. A nomadic existence built around film productions and theatrical engagements, and the simple fact that a family of this fame couldn't stay anywhere for long without the machinery of celebrity closing in. The children attended multiple schools across multiple countries. They had no fixed address in the way most children have a fixed address, no bedroom that stayed the same from season to season, no street they knew in their bones. What they had instead was luggage, a rotating cast of attendants and bodyguards, and a mother who was always either working or ill, or fighting with or reconciling with the largest personality most of them would encounter in their lives. Their lives became part of their public images. Kashner and Schoenberger wrote of the Burtons, the movies paralleling the gossip, blurring the boundaries between what was real and what was performance. The children lived inside that blurring. A paparazzi photograph of Elizabeth Taylor shopping in Rome was on the front page of a newspaper somewhere in the world on most days of the 1960s. Her children were in those photographs. Their faces were known to strangers before those children fully understood what strangers were. Burton formally adopted Liza Todd and Maria Burton after marrying Taylor in 1964. He didn't adopt Michael or Christopher. They retained the Wilding name, but he was the dominant male figure of their formative years regardless. He was there, in the suite, on the yacht, at the dinner table that was always a different dinner table in a different country. Alcohol killed Richard Burton, one biographical account states flatly, though the official cause of his death in August 1984 was a brain hemorrhage. His published diaries are described as frank about the drinking, about the volatility of the relationship, about the fights that were legendary for their scale and the reconciliations that were equally operatic. The children grew up watching two people they loved destroy each other in slow motion, and rebuild and destroy again. One specific tangible detail illustrates how completely the family and spectacle boundary had dissolved by the mid-1960s. In 1967, both Michael and Christopher appeared as extras in The Taming of the Shrew, the Taylor Burton Shakespeare adaptation filmed in Rome. Michael was 14, Christopher was 12. They walked through the frame of their parents' professional collaboration, present in the production, part of the image being made. Whether this was charming parental inclusion or something more revealing about how thoroughly the domestic and the theatrical had merged, that's a question with no clean answer. What it demonstrates is that for these children, there was no outside to their parents' world. They were inside it, always, even when the cameras were rolling. Burton's two marriages to Taylor, 1964 to 1974, then a brief remarriage in October 1975, followed by a final divorce in July 1976, meant the dominant male presence of the children's formative years cycled through their home twice. He left, he came back, he left again. Two stepfathers named Burton bookending the same turbulent decade, the same man playing two different chapters of the same impossible story. Maria's origin is the counter-argument the critics never reach when they build the bad mother case. In early 1961, Taylor learned of a German infant orphan with congenital hip defects. The actress, Maria Schell, had located the child and brought her to Taylor's attention. Taylor and then-husband Eddie Fisher renamed the infant Maria, after Schell herself, as a gesture of gratitude for finding the child. The adoption process began. Then, the marriage situation shifted. Taylor divorced Fisher in March 1964. Burton entered. The adoption paperwork had Fisher named as the adoptive father, and it had to be redone entirely with Burton substituted in his place. This required navigating legal processes across an international divorce and remarriage, a bureaucratic tangle that would have given most people legitimate grounds to set the whole thing aside. Taylor didn't set it aside. She kept going. On December 21st, the adoption was finalized, with Richard Burton named on the documents. Maria Burton had a family name and a legal family, after a process that had stretched across 2 of Taylor's marriages and the better part of 3 years. Over the years that followed, Maria underwent surgery after surgery for the congenital hip defects she'd been born with, approximately 22 procedures across her childhood. The first documented surgery occurred in Los Angeles in July 1961, when Maria was an infant. Then more, spread across her growing years, each one a logistical and emotional demand on a mother who was simultaneously managing a film career, a marriage, and 3 other children. Taylor was present for as many of these as she could reach. What this looks like at a practical level is a woman who spent years of her life in hospital waiting rooms and recovery rooms for a child who didn't share her blood, a child she had specifically, deliberately, bureaucratically chosen and refused to unchoose when it became complicated. Whatever Elizabeth Taylor was as a mother, and she was complicated, genuinely complicated. She wasn't someone who chose convenience or distance, when it came to Maria. Taylor's health crises ran alongside the domestic chaos and were, in their own way, formative for the children. In 1961, while The Butterfield 8 was in theaters, the film that would win her first Academy Award, Taylor contracted pneumonia severe enough to require a tracheotomy. She was hospitalized and came close to dying. Michael was 8, Christopher was 6, Liza was 3. They grew up watching their mother nearly die before the addiction crisis of the 1980s added its own layer to that pattern. By the time Taylor's body started failing in the ways that would ultimately kill her, her children had been watching her survive impossible things for their entire lives. They were practiced at the specific vigilance of people who love someone who keeps almost not surviving. They'd been practicing since childhood. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the external chaos of the marriages had largely resolved. Taylor married the Republican Senator John Warner in 1976, but the internal chaos had been accumulating for 2 decades and was approaching a breaking point. Taylor's back pain was chronic and real, rooted in a horse riding accident during the filming of National Velvet when she was a teenager. The pain never left. The prescriptions that addressed it had multiplied over the years into something that had long since stopped being medical management. Taylor's own account, given to the New York Times in February 1985, is precise and unflinching about what this looked like in practice. I was taking a lot of Percodan. I'd take Percodan and a couple of drinks before I would go out. She described a 25-year drug habit in that same interview, which means the roots of the dependency stretched back to approximately 1959. The year after Mike Todd died, the year Liza was born, the year the Fisher affair began its slow detonation. The timeline connects in ways that aren't incidental. The picture that emerges from multiple sources is of polypharmacy at an extreme level. Multiple substances, multiple prescribing physicians, the architecture of dependency that extreme wealth and fame can sustain for far longer than any normal system would allow. By the early 1980s, 3 physicians had been writing prescriptions for Taylor in combinations and quantities that no single doctor had full visibility into. The children could see the result. They couldn't see the mechanism clearly enough to dismantle it. There were conversations. Christopher Wilding described them in the BBC documentary Elizabeth Taylor, Rebel Superstar, the most candid, sustained account any of Taylor's children has given of what the addiction years actually looked like from inside the family. "We'd talk to her," he said, "but things got to the point where it was decided an intervention would be necessary. We just wanted her to get help. Close family members flew in, and boy, that was difficult." Close family members flew in. Adult children in their late 20s and early 30s, each already building their own independent life, receiving word that the situation had escalated beyond what conversations could address, and boarding planes to converge in the same room, to sit across from their mother and say what needed to be said. Michael was 30, Christopher was 28, Liza was 26, Maria was in her early 20s. All of them made the trip. Christopher added in the same BBC interview, "We were all petrified. She was a formidable woman." Petrified. Not angry, though anger would have been entirely legitimate. Not resentful, though resentment would have been earned. Petrified, afraid of the woman, afraid of what saying the necessary thing to her would cost them, afraid of what would happen if they didn't. Taylor had been the largest presence in every room she occupied for their entire lives, and now she was dying by degrees, and they were sitting across from her with the truth, and the truth was terrible, and they were scared. On December 5, 1983, Elizabeth Taylor checked into the Betty Ford Center at Eisenhower Medical Center in Rancho Mirage, California. She stayed for 7 weeks. For the first time in her adult life, she shared a room with a stranger and performed household chores, tasks so routine as to be nearly disorienting for a woman who had been waited on since childhood. She later described the experience. "For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't being exploited by anyone. I was being accepted for myself. I was forced to look at the honest truth of who I was." On February 29, 1984, she gave a press statement after her discharge. Her life, she said, had been filled with genuine pain. She had kicked a 25-year drug habit. She said it publicly, which she wasn't required to do, which suggests the Betty Ford experience had cracked something open in her that she no longer wanted to keep closed. And then, in recorded audio that the BBC documentary later played, her own voice, she asked the question that the "and she knew it" in the title is actually about. "I thought I was a good mother. How have I allowed myself to do this to the people I love most in the world?" Not a deathbed confession, not a letter surfaced after her death. A recorded question, in her own voice, asked about her own children, carrying the specific weight of someone who has looked clearly at what she's done and can't make what she sees go away. She knew. She carried it. And 5 years later, in 1988, she relapsed. She returned to Betty Ford for a second stay, this time prompted not by her children, but by her friend George Hamilton. The family wasn't the ones to make the call the second time. They'd already done their part in 1983. They had flown in. They had been petrified. They had sat across from their formidable mother and said what needed to be said. And it had worked for 5 years. And then it hadn't. The second time, they let someone outside the family carry the weight of that call. That's not abandonment. That's the specific self-preservation of people who have already given what they had to give and know their own limits. During that second stay, Taylor met a construction worker named Larry Fortensky, also undergoing treatment at Betty Ford. She married him in 1991 at Neverland Ranch in a ceremony hosted by Michael Jackson. It was her 8th marriage. Her children were, at this point, adults in their mid to late 30s who had been watching this pattern for their entire lives. What all 4 of them did in the years surrounding and following the addiction crisis was make a series of choices that look, in aggregate, like a very deliberate plan. None pursued acting as a primary career. None wrote memoirs. None cultivated a public profile that traded on the Taylor name. The choices were individual, but the direction was consistent. Away from the camera, into lives that the press had no particular reason to photograph. Christopher Wilding's career is the most extensively documented of the 4. He worked in film, but entirely behind it, in roles designed to be invisible to audiences. He worked as an assistant sound editor on Apartment Zero, Loverboy, and The Shadow. He served as a cameraman on The Mirror Cracked in 1980. He moved into film editing and stayed there until his retirement around 2016, living in Calabasas with his wife Margie. In September 2024, he gave an extended interview to The Guardian, one of the most candid conversations he'd granted the press about his mother in years, and described his editing career as undistinguished. He said it with the dry precision of someone who had worked very hard to achieve exactly that result. Undistinguished, in Christopher Wilding's case, wasn't a failure. It was an accomplishment. He had spent his entire professional life inside the art form that made his mother's name synonymous with spectacle, and he had remained entirely invisible within it. The art form was the family language. Anonymity within it was the only way to speak it on his own terms. He'd also, in his private life, navigated 3 marriages. First, to Eileen Getty, granddaughter of the oil tycoon J. Paul Getty, a marriage that ended in 1989. Then to Margaret Carleton, with whom he had a son named Lowell Wilding in 1991. Then to Margie. He has been the most publicly available of the 4 siblings in recent years, surfacing in a People magazine interview in 2024 when Taylor Swift named a song about his mother, and he found himself unexpectedly referenced in contemporary pop culture. He appeared to find this genuinely surprising, which says something about how completely he had stepped out of the slipstream of his mother's fame. Michael Wilding Jr. made a handful of acting appearances: Dallas in 1978, Deadly Illusion in 1987, the soap opera Guiding Light, before moving into work as a businessman and preservationist. He married Brooke Palance, daughter of the actor Jack Palance, in 1982. He has a daughter named Layla. He does not give interviews. The statement he released after his mother's death, "My mother was an extraordinary woman who lived life to the fullest, with great passion, humor, and love," is the longest thing attributed to him in the public record of recent decades. He is the eldest, the one who saw the most of it, and the quietest. Liza Todd has been a professional sculptor since 1979. She trained at the Hornsey College of Art in London and then at the Otis Institute in Los Angeles, 2 institutions on 2 different continents, an education that was itself a kind of deliberate broadening away from the Hollywood Center. She specializes in equestrian and animal bronze sculpture, working in a medium that is slow, physical, and tactile, about as far from the gossip column as an art form can be. Her commissions include sculptures of champion racehorses, Northern Dancer, Seattle Slew, and John Henry. She is described by those in the field as one of the foremost equestrian sculptors working in her generation. Her official biography notes that since childhood, she has been involved with animals, especially horses. She found something genuine in that world, something entirely her own, long before she was old enough to understand that she was choosing it as an alternative to the other world available to her. Maria Burton Carson became a clothing designer and philanthropist, living in Idaho. She took the surname Carson. She has her own children. She has given no major press interviews about her childhood or her relationship with Elizabeth Taylor. Of the 4, she is the most private, and the privacy appears to be a deep preference rather than a circumstantial outcome. None of Elizabeth Taylor's 4 children became famous, observes one biographical account, a sentence that reads as a failure if you expect them to have followed their mother's path, and reads as a considered choice if you understand what it cost to step off it. The contrast with other famous Hollywood children is clarifying, precisely because it shows how many different ways this story could have gone. Christina Crawford published Mommy Dearest in 1978, the scorched earth memoir that permanently rewired how the world understood Joan Crawford, written with the explicit purpose of public settlement of a private score. Taylor's children published no equivalent. Not one of the 4, in any interview in any decade, said publicly what they might have had every right to say. Liza Minnelli and Lorna Luft, Judy Garland's daughters, remained in the entertainment world and carried the weight of their mother's legacy forward in ways that were visible across their own careers and struggles. Taylor's children broke that pattern entirely. They neither wrote the memoir nor dove deeper into the lights. They chose a third thing: genuine, sustained, deliberate privacy. Quiet professional lives, built at a careful distance from the machinery that had processed their childhoods as entertainment. That refusal took sustained effort across decades. Fame was available to them. The Taylor name was currency. They declined to spend it. By the time February 11th, 2011 arrived, Elizabeth Taylor was 78 years old and had been managing congestive heart failure for 7 years. The condition had been diagnosed in 2004 and had steadily narrowed the perimeter of her world. She was admitted to Cedars-Sinai that February for symptoms that required extended hospitalization. She stayed for 6 weeks. Those 6 weeks are the final proof the story needs, and it requires no interpretation. Hospital vigils aren't obligatory for adult children with independent lives in separate cities. They require disruption and effort, and the physical fact of choosing to be in a building where the news is going to be bad and getting worse. You sit in rooms where the light is wrong, and the chairs were designed by no one with comfort in mind, and you bring things to read that you don't manage to read, and you go back the next day anyway. You go because the alternative, not going, is something you'd carry for the rest of your life. Michael Wilding Jr. was 58 years old that March, the eldest, the one who had known his mother the longest. Christopher was 56. Liza was 53, in the middle of a serious sculpture career she had spent 20 years building. Maria Burton Carson was 49, living in Idaho with her own family and her own children. All 4 of them came to Cedars-Sinai. All 4 of them were in that hospital over those 6 weeks. Barbara Walters, who had known Taylor for years and had been in recent contact with her, told The Hollywood Reporter on the morning of March 23rd, "We were in touch. I thought that she might make it." She didn't make it. Congestive heart failure, the condition that had been taking her since 2004, completed its work on the morning of March 23rd, 2011. She was 79 years old, born February 27th, 1932, and she left behind 4 children, 10 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. Sally Morrison's statement went out that morning to ABC News and the New York Times. She was surrounded by her children, Michael Wilding, Christopher Wilding, Liza Todd, and Maria Burton. 4 names, the complete list, not one absent. Michael Wilding Jr. released a statement. "My mother was an extraordinary woman who lived life to the fullest, with great passion, humor, and love." A second line was recorded that day. "The world is a better place for her having lived in it." Those aren't the words of a man reading from legal obligation. They are the words of a son who has already done the hard work of sorting out what he feels about a complicated mother, and arrived somewhere that resembles peace, not because the complications weren't real, but because peace was more useful than the alternative, and he'd had 58 years to get there. Taylor had left one final instruction, consistent with who she'd been across 8 decades of being relentlessly, indelibly herself. Her funeral was to begin 15 minutes after its announced time. She wanted to be late for her own funeral. She got that. The story does not close on March 23rd, 2011. It's still going, run by the people who were in that room. Elizabeth Taylor founded the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, at a moment when doing so cost something real. In the mid-1980s, when the AIDS epidemic was killing tens of thousands of people, and the Reagan administration was declining to name it in public speeches, when Hollywood was largely keeping its distance from the crisis, Taylor stepped forward. She testified before Congress. She lent her face and her name and her specific kind of immovable, attention-commanding presence to a cause that most of her peers were carefully avoiding. It became, by most assessments, the most consequential work of the second half of her life, more lasting than any film, more durable than any marriage. Her children and grandchildren are still running it. Her granddaughter, Eliza Carson, Maria's daughter, serves as an ambassador for the foundation. In People magazine, Taylor's grandchild, Quinn, published an essay about continuing the Foundation's AIDS work, describing it not as an administrative inheritance, but as a personal calling, a mission that belongs to them as much as it belonged to the woman who started it. The Foundation has its own operational infrastructure, its own ambassadors program, its own ongoing advocacy work, carried forward because the people who loved Taylor chose to carry it, when they were under no obligation to do so. This is the final refutation of the premise. People who never forgave a woman don't dedicate their lives to continuing the one thing she believed in most. They don't run her foundation, speak publicly on behalf of her legacy, and describe her work as a mission that belongs to them. They don't fly in from 4 different cities and sit in a hospital for 6 weeks and be in the room at the end. Elizabeth Taylor's children had real grievances. The anger the title gestures at was real. Grown in a household built on chaos, nomadic instability, addiction, and the specific psychological weight of being raised as supporting characters in someone else's story when you are, in fact, the protagonist of your own. Christopher Wilding called his entire career undistinguished in a national newspaper in 2024. Michael Wilding Jr. doesn't give interviews. Liza Todd pours bronze into molds in her studio, working in the long, slow, deliberate opposite of everything her mother's career represented. Maria Burton lives quietly in Idaho. The marks are there. The anger left them. But the children came to Cedars-Sinai. They wrote those statements. They kept running that foundation. And they never, not once, not one of the 4, said publicly what they might have had every right to say. What Taylor's children did is harder to name than forgiveness, and more durable. They survived her. They survived the machine she was, the chaos she generated, the addiction she carried and named and fought, and sometimes lost to, the marriages and the fame and the cameras that never stopped. They survived all of it, built quiet lives at a deliberate distance from the spectacle, and then, when it mattered, they came back. They were there at the end. They kept her work alive after. That's not a tragic fate. That's what love looks like when it's had to fight very hard for itself for a very long time. Subscribe for more stories like this.